We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for a political, economic, and social alternative.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
This is a far, far more serious crisis.
Tens of thousands of people are going out to protest every week.
There's a lot to do, and we have a world to win. Welcome back, everyone. This is World to Win. My name's Toya, a member of the International Socialist Alternative. And unfortunately, my new co-host, Ya'ara, wasn't able to make it today. I know everyone's wicked disappointed, but don't worry, she'll be back with us next week. I want everyone to take a moment. Sorry we started a little late today, but let's get the word out and let everyone know that we're watching this exciting episode of World to Win. Start a watch party, share it on your social media, you know the deal. And make sure you like and comment and subscribe to our channel. This show today is part two of a two-part series marking the 80th anniversary of Trotsky's assassination. That's Leon Trotsky. We'll be talking to Rob Jones, who's a member of the International Socialist Alternative International Executive. How's it going, Rob? And he's a long-standing member of our organization in Russia. Last week, we talked about one of Trotsky's greatest contributions to the socialist movement, which was this theory of permanent revolution. Now, if you missed that episode, you can totally still watch it after today's show, of course. You can find it on Facebook or on our YouTube channel. So today, we're going to be dealing with part two, which is Trotsky's revolutionary life, dominating by the struggle against Stalinism. But before we get started, for those of you who have read something by Leon Trotsky or a little more familiar with his work, and don't worry, you don't have to be an expert by any means to watch this episode, but those of you who have read something by him, what have you read? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to see what people's favorite pieces are and what they liked about them. I know for me, I talked a little bit about it last week, but there's a collection of his articles on women's liberation called Women in the Family, which I really like. But I'm reading In Defense of Marxism, which is a collection of letters during a debate that was happening in the US Trotskyist movement in the 1930s. And many of those who know me may say that I love this because a lot of the exchanges were between Trotsky and James Cannon, who's my favorite revolutionary in history. But it's really interesting to read in almost like real time what people were saying about the debates that were happening and how they responded to each other, especially considering it was so long ago. They didn't have email and they had to wait to hear the news and for the letter to get there. It's just super exciting. But what are your favorite pieces? Let me know. But let's get right into it. We're going to start with this question of Stalinism. And what is it? I mean, we hear this term a lot, and actually a lot of people who critique socialism oftentimes give arguments against Stalinism. But me personally, when I think of Stalinism, I think of a lack of democracy, whereas when I think of socialism, I think of democratic control. And Leon Trotsky himself says that Stalinism is not guided by Marxist theory, or any theory at all for that matter, but by the empirical interests of the Soviet bureaucracy. So let's go to Rob. What is Stalinism and what did Trotsky mean? Rob, you're on mute. There you go. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Yes, indeed, Toya. When I first joined our international a few years back, the Soviet Union still existed. And when we used to sell papers on the streets in Britain, quite often people would come up to us and tell us, go back to Russia. You've got socialism there, why don't you go and live there? And I think the answer that we always gave was that if you look at what the Soviet Union had achieved at that time, it had a planned economy, it had developed from being a very backward nation in 1917 to being one of the two great world powers, able to compete in many areas with the USA or with Europe, sending the first man into space, and so on and so forth. But then we would say, aside from that, the planned economy was being destroyed by bureaucracy. And the points that you've just made, Toya, about the lack of democracy, was a tremendous drawback because many people were attracted by the economic strength of the USSR, but they didn't like the lack of freedom. The fact that workers had no control of the factories or of the economy, that you couldn't speak out openly on issues that affected you, that there were many nationalities that felt that their rights were being restricted in the Baltic states, partly in the Ukraine, in the Caucasus and so on, and even some nationalities within Russia itself. And of course, the other issue that we think made us stand out from what the Stalinist system pointed out is that we have always been internationalists. We always understand that you can't have socialism in an isolated country because it's surrounded by a sea of capitalism that is going to do everything it can to strangle the benefits of this system. And therefore you have to have an international, if you like, a world socialist system. And I think that was a problem at that time. It's less of a problem now because many of these systems have collapsed or don't exist anymore. But Stalinism, whatever color it had, whether it was Maoism in China, Chiang Kai-shek in Vietnam, Tito in Yugoslavia, or elsewhere, they used the bureaucracy, used the advantages of the planned economy largely for its own benefit. For example, they spent an awful lot of money on weapons, on arms, on the police state to maintain itself in power, when a lot of that money could have been spent on improving workers' living conditions. All the other aspects that we would normally associate with socialism were missing. Even international solidarity was missing. I remember during the Great British Miners' Strike that the Polish government, which at that time called itself communist, said in words that it was socialist, it was for international solidarity, but in practice was selling scab coal to Britain to help break the miners' strike. And so on all the other aspects, we see that Stalinism was a reaction, was a negation of everything that a genuine socialist society should be. Now, when I first came to visit the Soviet Union, it was in 1988, and I went with one of our elected MPs at that time, Terry Fields from Liverpool. So actually we went in 1990 with Terry, but we went to the miners' areas in Siberia. And we saw there that despite this being a worker state, in words, in inverted commas, the living conditions of the workers were no better than you would find on some of the poorer state-owned working class estates in Liverpool or Glasgow or London. But not only that, the workers were deprived of the rights of having genuine trade unions. They had no means of having their voice heard in any genuine way, and they faced tremendous shortages of basic products. The miners that we met with were on strike because they didn't have soap to wash themselves with in the showers that they needed to take after work. And so you had the bureaucracy completely destroyed the benefits of the planned economy by the late 1980s, which to a large degree explains why when there were attempts to restore capitalism, there wasn't any great resistance to that process because people didn't see the benefits of a socialist society that the Soviet Union was supposed to be. Now, I think if you look back in periods, it wasn't always like that. Because when Lenin and Trotsky led the revolution in 1917, they and the rest of the Bolsheviks, and I include in that term even Stalin, at that time, supported the idea that you could only have a revolution in Russia if it became the first step in a world revolution. Because in backward, isolated peasant Russia that had been destroyed by 4 years of the First World War, and then followed by the Civil War, it was impossible to restore the economy without help from the more advanced, technologically advanced countries of Europe and maybe even the US itself, and in particular without the help of the more cultured, the more organized, the more politically conscious working class of those countries. But unfortunately, Lenin, Trotsky, the Bolsheviks faced tremendous difficulties. The first thing they faced, of course, was the destruction caused by the war, and then the civil war that was caused by the intervention of the imperialists to support the reactionary White Guards in Russia. You had the failure of the German Revolution, which had the potential for change in the face of the whole of Europe, and obviously helping the situation in Russia. You had a backward working class in Russia, in the sense that although small groups of them were politically very well advanced to be members of the Bolshevik Party and so on, en masse, and linked up with the huge peasantry that dominated society, there was a low political culture, which meant that every time there was a step back from the revolution, there was a strengthening of reactionary ideas and a strengthening of this reactionary bureaucracy that was beginning to develop in society. Now, Lenin and Trotsky tried to tackle that. They introduced what they called the new economic policy, which was a concession to capitalism. The idea was that the new Russian socialist state would allow the development of small-scale capitalism in the cities, in the countryside, with the hope that it would help to develop the economy so that workers' living standards could be to some degree restored after the Civil War, but also, and probably more importantly, that would give a breathing space for revolution to develop elsewhere. Now, that at least was the idea. But of course, with the defeat in Germany and the setbacks elsewhere, this actually led to a strengthening of the, if you like, the capitalist elements, that led to a strengthening of the bureaucracy, that led to a strengthening around Stalin and his society. And in order to maintain power, they introduced a whole number of economic policies that led to disaster, such as forced collectivization, that left millions of peasants starved to death, in effect. It didn't particularly help industry. You had the suppression of national groups, and of course you had the political state, the political police develop, which fought a particularly bloody battle against the former Bolsheviks, the former leaders of the revolution. Are there lessons for today? Yes, there are. The first lesson, of course, is that it doesn't matter whether we're in the most powerful of the capitalist countries in the world, or the largest country, or the one that has the first revolution. The lesson is that we always have to have the perspective that the revolution has to develop internationally in order for us to be able to develop a genuine, free, socialist society. We have to remember what socialism really means. In my opinion, socialism without democracy, without freedom, without rights of women, without freedom for the LGBT community, for national rights, and without workers having direct control and management of industry, that's not socialism, it's a caricature of it. And therefore, we have to have that in our mind all the time. Don't look back to what happened in the Soviet Union as a positive example. We learn the lessons from the past. And of course, we need internationalism in all our work.
Thanks so much, Rob. I mean, it's really important to talk about what Stalinism actually was, and not focus on, the degeneration, of a socialist society, but really focusing on how we got there. And you talked a lot about, what Lenin and Trotsky tried to do to fight back against some of these things. Trotsky and Lenin were the ones that really led the revolution. Stalin didn't play the role that Lenin and Trotsky did. And we know Lenin got sick and died. But I've heard criticisms, I've heard that Trotsky refused to accept, a deputy position to Lenin to be able to be the next in charge once Lenin died. And I've heard things about Trotsky holding back and not really confronting Stalin head on some of his differences that actually you did talk about in one episode. Rob's a regular panelist here with us when you talked about the differences of Lenin and Stalin's policy on the national question. But is this true that Trotsky didn't do enough to fight back? And, is he partly to blame for Stalin being able to do what he did?
Well, I don't think you could say that's the case, really. The Bolshevik Party was always a party at least when Lenin and Trotsky were at the head of it, it was a party where there were burning discussions, sometimes with quite brutal disagreements and the formation of factions, people defending different ideas, but then able to come together again at the end of it as a collective leadership. Stalin became General Secretary in 1923. And I think that's actually quite an important issue, because before that, the Bolshevik Party did not have a General Secretary. It was a post created for somebody to deal with the administrative questions within the Bolshevik Party. That was never meant to be the one person decided everything. But of course, over years, over basically a 20-year period, it became to mean a one-person dictatorship, not just in the party, but over the country as a whole. Now, I've heard many different arguments. Well, the whole problem was the Bolshevik Party was undemocratic to begin with. Well, that wasn't true. It was probably the most democratic party at that time, and it's probably far, far more democratic than most parties you could see around today in any country. The second thing is, well, if Trotsky had come to power, he would have been the same as Stalin. Well, Trotsky took this point up and he said, well, there is an element of truth in that, because the question was not the personality who was in charge of the party. It was the objective situation that developed around the revolution that led to its degeneration. And if Stalin hadn't been there, Stalin happened to be a very convenient personality who didn't really have an understanding of democratic discussion. But if Stalin hadn't been there, they would have found somebody else. And of course, there's the other argument that, well, Trotsky should have done more to oppose it. Now, I don't agree with that, because I'm not somebody who thinks that Trotsky never made any mistakes or Trotsky never missed any opportunities. Nobody is like that. Everybody has their weaknesses and their faults. But Trotsky, in my opinion, did fight from the very beginning. In 1923, Lenin already identified some of the problems developing in the new Bolshevik state. He could see a new state bureaucracy developing, and he proposed that there be more workers and peasants brought on to the inspectorate that was supposed to control the bureaucracy. As it happens, that didn't work. That's another question. But in particular, Lenin got very angry about the way that Stalin and his supporters were dealing with the national question. Now, that's commonly accepted that there were arguments in Georgia about how the Soviet Russia should deal with the new Georgian state, which was under the control of the Mensheviks at the time. But it wasn't just that. It was a way that the people around Stalin were using great Russian nationalism, chauvinism, against non-Russian nationalities. It was also about the issue of how the Soviet Union should be formed, because Stalin was responsible for drawing up the plan to develop the Soviet Union. And his initial proposal was that the other republics, Soviet republics, that is the one in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, what was called the Transcaucasian Republic, and Ukraine, they should all be integrated into socialist Russia and given certain rights of autonomy within that. Now, Lenin was very unhappy at that, because he thought that would make these people subservient. So therefore, he suggested that, no, there should be equal rights. Each republic should be right. Now, he asked Trotsky to help with this. He proposed to Trotsky to form a bloc to fight this growing bureaucracy. And Trotsky agreed. The problem is, at the very first meeting after Lenin died, Stalin and his friends made a big retreat on the national question. Stalin published an article in Pravda, which he started off by attacking great Russian chauvinism. Now, Trotsky could hardly come out then with a big attack on that issue. So he then chose to direct the attack on the economy, where he said there's a crisis in the economy developing. Agricultural goods are not too cheap for the peasantry to be able to buy industrial goods, in other words, tractors and so on and so forth. He called it the scissors crisis. There was a gap growing. Therefore, Trotsky said you should have more emphasis on planning the industrial section of the economy so that there could be cheaper goods produced to help develop agriculture. And he started off the battle on that issue. And of course, for 15 years, he and his supporters waged a brutal battle on all the different issues that arose within the Soviet Union, which not only led to mass expulsions from the party in the beginning, then exile, then arrests, and then, of course, in the 30s, to the horrific mass execution of literally thousands of Trotskyists and other members of the party who had dared to speak out at one time or another against Trotskyism. So I don't agree that they didn't struggle. The question is, how do you struggle and at what time?
Thanks so much, Rob. You gave us a lot to deal with there. And Sonia actually commented and said her favorite books are My Life and Revolution Betrayed. And so you can read a lot about what Rob laid out in those two books. Actually, I haven't read My Life. It's very thick. So if you're going to take on that book, make sure you have some time, a highlighter to get through it. But Revolution Betrayed is a good one as well. So I want to move on a little bit, talking about the left opposition. I have mainly two questions, but first, if you could just explain what the left opposition was and how big it was in Russia during this time.
Well, the left opposition, it went through different phases, and at some times it formed union with other groups. For example, it had a short union with a group around Zinoviev, Kamenev, and so on. At other times it had other allies, but in general the left opposition focused on specific aspects. First of all is how the economy should develop. Secondly is how workers' democracy and Soviet democracy should be restored. How the revolution should develop in other countries, because the Stalinist bureaucracy very quickly made very major mistakes in Germany, in Britain during the 1926 general strike, and in China, where in essence the Comintern, the Stalinist International, by then a Stalinist International, recommended to the Chinese communists that they should work as part of the Kuomintang, which was a bourgeois nationalist party. And as long as the Kuomintang wanted to help with the communists and the working class, it was happy to accept. But as soon as their interests divided, they launched a coup in the country and murdered a wide layer of communists and of workers and so on. And the policy in China was an absolute disaster, as it was in Germany, as it was in Britain, as it was in a whole number of other countries. And the problem with this is that Trotsky and other members of the left opposition. Preobrazhensky was a strong economist, for example. He did a lot of writing on the economy. Other people did material on the international events and so on. It wasn't just Trotsky laying down the line on everything. But quite often they criticized in advance what the Stalinists were doing. The Stalinist policies led to a disaster. The left opposition were proved correct. That led to a growth in support for the left opposition amongst the active and politically conscious party members. And at different times, you saw different figures. At one time, there was a figure put around that the left opposition had up to, I think, 80,000 supporters at one time. But amongst the mass of workers, the mass of party members who were not politically developed, politically conscious, and amongst the peasantry, of course, every defeat caused by Stalinism led to demoralization, to despair, and strengthened the conservatism and the demoralization that led to the Stalinist bureaucracy. So you had, if you like, a paradox. The left opposition was correct politically, but because of the defeat, it was weakened. It was fighting a losing battle in the country. Now, when you go through, different people say that Trotsky was isolated, the left opposition didn't have many supporters and so on, and that's just not true. About 6 months ago, they were digging up a building in the city of Ekaterinburg in the Urals, an old prison, and they found buried under the floorboards minutes from the left opposition cell that existed in that prison in the 30s. And it had details about a network of supporters they had in all the different prisons and so on. And they could count on hundreds and probably thousands of supporters in the prisons. In fact, there were uprisings in the prisons. In Vorkuta, thousands took part in a hunger strike. The hunger strike was defeated, and most of those were executed outside a brick. They were taken outside a brick factory and just shot in their droves. In the Far East, another strike of prisoners was led, and the leaders of that strike were Eltsin, not Yeltsin. Eltsin, he was a leading member of the left opposition, also like Yeltsin from Ekaterinburg. But one of the other leaders was Sokolovskaya, who was Trotsky's first wife. And you see really just masses and masses of people prepared to stand up and support his idea, but unable to overcome the whole wave that was leading to the degeneration of the revolution. And of course, in the 1930s, the purges, the mass trials that took place, it annihilated the old layer of the Bolsheviks. I can't show them here, but I have pictures. I have a picture of Trotsky's family tree. And his brothers, his sisters, his sons, his daughter, his two wives, they were all, if they didn't die a natural death, they were all executed in one way or another. I have a picture of the Central Committee elected in 1917. And apart from 4 people who were supporters of Stalin, the rest all died in the Civil War or were executed. Or I think 3 of them died of illness. So it was a massive counter-revolution that left Stalinism and his bureaucracy in control in what was once a potentially healthy workers' state.
I mean, I want to go off what you just said there at the end, but I mean, prison documents under the floorboards, that's crazy and like extremely exciting. I never knew that they were holding meetings and keeping minutes in prisons. It's just extremely inspiring. But also what you described of this, massive campaign to basically murder and take out anyone who was opposed to, Stalin's regime and his rule just goes to show that we can't link the ideas with a better world against capitalism, a socialist world, to what happened, in the Soviet Union at this time. But this, Rob, this is a debate that's still being had, not just among people who are on the left, but just, working class people, and especially young people who are coming to these ideas for the first time, who didn't necessarily grow up during the time of the Soviet Union. Russia had a revolution where the workers took control of society. Stalin came to power. How do we describe what the society was? Was this a capitalist society during the Soviet Union? Was it state capitalism? What was Trotsky's take on it, and what's your take on what the USSR was?
Well, as you say, this is a debate that has gone on really since 1917. There were even people in the early 20s around the workers' opposition who started to say that the Soviet Union was becoming state capitalist. But this word means different things to different people. Lenin used the phrase state capitalism to describe some of the small-scale capitalist enterprises that were part of the new economic policy. In other words, capitalist companies that were working for the benefit of the state and the planned economy. But they didn't dominate the economy. The economy was dominated by state ownership of the major enterprises and planning, initially democratic planning, and then in the later stages of bureaucratic, stagnatic, conservative planning that took place in the last few decades after the war. So you can't say that capitalism was restored until the process that took place after 1990, when capitalism was restored with a vengeance, mass privatization, promises of democracy, but as we see in Russia or Belarus today, and other former Soviet republics, autocratic systems being established. But of course, this debate went on for a while. You talked about In Defense of Marxism, the book you're reading at the moment. Well, one of the big debates in that is between supporters of Trotsky and Cannon on the one hand, Shachtman and Burnham on the other. And they were arguing that you had a form of bureaucratic collectivism develop in the Soviet Union, that you could no longer support the Soviet Union in any way not even because of its planned economy, because it had become a completely reactionary force. Well, of course, the role that the Soviet Union played in the Second World War negates that argument, because without that, we would probably have a fascist Europe coming out of the Second World War. So you have to be careful how you use these phrases. Now, there is one tendency that developed out of what became the left opposition, became the Fourth International, that actually described, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe as state capitalists. By that, they meant that the whole system is run for the interests of the capitalist class, and the capitalist class was the bureaucracy. Now, of course, at that time there was no hereditary rights. You couldn't pass on ownership. The bureaucrats didn't actually own industry. They could only, in effect, mismanage it and take out some of the resources for their own private benefit and so on. But in general, it remained a planned economy with the advantages of a planned economy. So we think it's wrong to call it a state capitalist society. We say it's a degenerate workers' state. And we would agree with Trotsky's position when he said, when he first formed the left opposition in Russia, he spoke about the need to reform the system, the need to reform the bureaucracy, to remove its privileges and so on. But after Hitler came to power, he changed that position. He said, now we need a political revolution. And that means to overthrow the bureaucracy, to take them out of all aspects of power, to replace them with workers and Soviet democracy at every level. But you wouldn't have had to change the economic base of society. That's what it means. You had a workers' state in the economy. It was degenerate at the state level. And I still think that was a correct description. Of course, by 1990, it had become far, far more degenerate, and the bureaucracy formed the new capitalist class in many cases. The new capitalists came out either of the bureaucracy or the Young Communist League or the KGB. There's very few new capitalists in Russia and Eastern Europe who didn't come out of one of those organizations. But that came very late on as capitalism was actually restored. And one other point about the question of state capitalism. It sounds like a theoretical issue, but practically it had big consequences here. Because in 1990, when our first small group here were on the barricades in 1991 against the right-wing reactionary conservative coup d'etat, the state capitalists criticized us and saying, it doesn't make any difference. Russia is already capitalist. What difference does it make if Yeltsin is in control of the right-winger in control? Now, of course, that was nonsense, because the population as a whole, and the working class in particular at that time, wanted freedom and they wanted democracy. A whole lot of them didn't want privatization and capitalism. And we would have been completely sectarian not to have been part of that process and to warn people that we needed independent workers' organizations. And later, they criticized us because on the national question, we spoke up in favor of the rights of national minorities in some of the other former Soviet republics. And they said that then we were representing Russian imperialism, which is also nonsense, because just as in Russia as well, we support the rights of all the nationalities here, the Chechens, the Tatars, and all the other nationalities that are here. So state capitalism appears to be a theoretical difference, but it had real practical consequences that put them basically on the wrong side of the barricades at a time of revolutionary events.
Thanks so much for explaining that nuance. And I mean, it just shows that we can't just, nothing is just black and white. And so that's why this history is so rich and important for us to discuss, so that we're able to fully analyze what was happening there. But I mean, a lot of the things that you're mentioning that were happening, 100 years ago, we're still dealing with today. The national question you brought up, which we're seeing different places around the world, dealing with this question in Israel, Palestine, places all over the world. But another thing that you were talking about was fascism. And so I want to, switch the conversation there and talking about fighting fascism, whether it be on people's minds to fight against policies that, Donald Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil puts forward, or, fascist thugs in the streets of Europe, fighting against oppressed people. People have this different idea about what fascism actually is. So can you talk a little bit about that and how Trotsky himself, he wrote extensively on this subject. Can you talk about how he analyzed fascism?
Yes, I think so. And it's important to make some introductory comments here, I think, because my parents' generation, many of them were conscript soldiers in the Second World War. And if they came from the working class, like my father did, and other people I knew, if you ever criticized the Soviet Union, they would come back with a comment, but the Soviet soldiers saved us from fascism. And there was that illusion amongst that generation that the Soviet Union played a big role in fighting fascism. When I came here, obviously, in the first few years, I would visit a few museums. And one of the spectacular museums I visited was in Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad, where, of course, the main battle of the Second World War took place. And they had hundreds of letters from soldiers on the wall, basically writing home to their parents or loved ones to say, tomorrow I'm going into battle, tomorrow I die, this is my last letter. But don't worry, I'm glad to be fighting fascism. If I have to give my life up, I'm quite happy to do it. And the role that the Soviet people, and in the eyes of many, the Soviet Union played in the Second World War, of course, was absolutely critical in defeating fascism. And the Stalinists, their fellow travelers, their successors, and by successors I include in that now Putin and Lukashenko, they play on this, about the history of how the Soviet Union defeated fascist Germany and so on. They're quite happy themselves to have Russian fascist support in them, of course, but they ignore that side of the question. But of course, if we look back deeper, we see a different history, because the reality of it is, if it hadn't been for the Stalinist degeneration of the Soviet Union, we probably wouldn't have seen the rise of fascism, of Hitlerism, in Italy, in Spain, and in other countries in the first place, because the Stalinist bureaucracy made a number of key mistakes, leaving aside the misdirection they gave to the German communists that led to the failure of the German Revolution. And if there'd been a German Revolution, then you wouldn't have had the rise of German fascism that laid waste to half of Europe. That was one issue. But the second issue was a complete mistake on tactics. In 1922, at Lenin's insistence, Trotsky wrote a resolution for the Comintern that was passed by the Comintern on the United Front. And Lenin was concerned because the German communists were ultra-left. They were sectarian. They didn't see the need to build unity of the working class, which is an issue that is extremely relevant today in a whole number of countries. And the whole point of United Front was that the communists in Germany should work on a day-to-day basis on day-to-day issues together with the social democratic workers, for example, to defend their meetings from fascist attack and so on, in order to build a unity in action and to put pressure on the leadership of the reformist organizations to move more to the left and to adopt a more revolutionary policy. But the Stalinists rejected this. Alongside their rejection of the global revolution, of world revolution, they spoke of socialism in one country. They then developed a theory, the so-called third period. And that meant the first period was the period after 1917 when there was a wave of revolutions. The second period from 1922 on was a period of supposed consolidation of capitalism. And then in 1928, apparently the third period started, a new revolutionary wave. And the Comintern said that in this situation, the communists should be the most radical, the most left-wing, and that the Social Democrats, and they were the biggest organization in Germany with mass trade unions, were no better than the fascists. In fact, they were worse than the fascists. They were social fascists who were conning the working class to support capitalism. And the communists ended up attacking the Social Democrats and even sometimes aligned themselves with the fascists against the Social Democrats. And here there's a theoretical issue that is very important, because the Comintern always described fascism as the if you like, the distilled essence of finance capital. Trotsky explained fascism as a movement of the demoralized and disillusioned petty bourgeois. And if you look at the two different things, you can draw different conclusions. And in particular, Trotsky gives a clear guide as to how the communists should work. You should have a united front, but you shouldn't drop your program. You should keep pushing the social, the economic program, because that's how you will win over the petty bourgeois. But if you don't put that program forward, the petty bourgeois will look for other avenues to struggle. And the right wing, the fascists, gave them that option. Now, today, fascism in the classical sense is probably not on the cards, at least at this particular time. The bourgeois are too afraid after what happened in Germany to give open support to a fascist government. But there's plenty of very far-right governments. I won't talk about your president, but President Trump, you've got Bolsonaro, you've got Putin here, you've got other far-right wingers in India and in other countries. And of course, some of the measures they use, the way, for example, that Lukashenko has promised to use force against the demonstrations that are taking place today in Minsk, and has said this week that he's going to shut any factories, close down any factories where people have been on strike this week. Now, in many ways, they are their measures that are not far from fascism. But we have to understand the root of it. In all these issues, a fascist is not a fascist because he happens to be a bad person. A fascist represents a particular ideology, and they get support because of the failure of capitalism in the first place to provide a proper living standard and all the means that people need to live. And it's a result of the failure of the working class movement to give an alternative. And therefore, we have to look at the lessons of the United Front, apply them to today, and they're still very, very relevant. And when we form these united fronts, and in Russia, sometimes we have a united front, even with some bourgeois organizations on democratic issues, on democratic rights. But we never give up our political and economic program. We always push forward our question of wages, of trade union rights, and so on and so forth, which the bourgeois don't like. They try and stop it. But it's important so that we offer an alternative in our work.
Thanks so much, Rob, for explaining that, how fascism comes to be. And, oftentimes I know in the US and school, when we're learning about fascism, we learn about Germany and Hitler, which you spoke about. But another thing that people talk about is Spain in the 1930s. And we got a question from John, who wants to know your opinion, Rob. He says, what is Rob's opinion about the role of Stalinism during the Spanish Civil War? There was a revolution, particularly in the 30s. Does he think Stalin consciously betrayed the Spanish Revolution? How would you respond to John?
Yes, put it bluntly. Maybe I should explain a bit more, because after the catastrophe in Germany, when Hitler came to power, Stalin didn't take part in the next meeting of the Comintern. He obviously wasn't quite clear how to put forward his position. The analysis was put forward by Georgy Dimitrov, who had been in a Nazi prison and had been released as part of a deal, prisoner exchange between Germany and the Soviet Union at the time. And Dimitrov put the position in the Comintern that we should go back to the United Front tactic. But when he spoke, what he actually said was that we should put at the forefront not the idea of a defense of what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat, what we would today call workers' democracy and socialism. But he said we should limit our demands to democratic rights and link up with all elements of bourgeois society that were prepared to do that. And what that meant was that in Spain, you had a popular front formed, not a united front, a popular front or a people's front, with elements of the bourgeois around the Republican government that fought just on democratic rights. And anybody who spoke out on the social demands, and that could be the people around Poland, which is sometimes called Trotskyist, but by that time was not Trotskyist, some of the anarchist groups that existed, and they had a mass base. Some socialists from the Socialist Party and independent socialists, they were treated as traitors by the Communist Party. And an uprising that took place in Barcelona was actually put down with the military might, with the backing of the Stalinist Communist Party. And I think that John, who posed this question, is correct to put it in this way. In the early period, maybe even in China, maybe even in the general strike in Britain, when the Stalinists proposed their wrong policies, they were mistaken policies. But by the time it came to Spain, it was quite clear that they did not want a socialist revolution in Spain, because if there had been a socialist revolution, which would have been the consequences of a proper policy by the communists there, it would have been an example to the workers of the Soviet Union that you don't have to have a lack of freedom. You don't have to have a bureaucracy. You can have genuine workers' democracy. And that, of course, you had socialism in Spain, socialism in the Soviet Union. The countries in between would be encouraged also to move in that direction. Revolution didn't take place. And, of course, there's many events and many facts and figures that can show that. If you want a good picture of how it could have been different, there's a very good film by Ken Loach, Land and Freedom. And one of my favourite scenes in there is when the communists are discussing with the peasants, and the peasants are saying, give us land, let us have land reform. That will help build support for the revolution. And the communists are saying, no, this is not a question for today. We're fighting for the republic. We can come back to that issue later. And because of that, they lost support amongst the peasantry. Because they didn't give promised national independence to Morocco, Franco was able to take many Morocco soldiers into his army that strengthened his army and so on. They made many, many mistakes that I agree, in my opinion, was an attempt to sabotage the revolution.
Love a good movie recommendation, Rob. You know, we've been talking a lot about books, but not enough movies are made about history that are actually true. And so you said that's Land and Freedom. That's a film on it. Great. So we should check that out. I actually have another question that I want to ask from someone on Facebook. And I think this question is so important, especially for young people across the world today. This person asks, what is the best way to fight fascism today? There are many different approaches, many forces on the left have adopted, from individual violence to supporting state suppression and surveillance of their movements. This person said they are interested in hearing a Trotskyist approach to the question. So I think it's fitting for our discussion today. Rob, what would you say to a young person that wants to know how we should fight fascism?
Well, I was active in the battle against organisations such as the National Front and the BNP in Britain when I was there. When I came here in the 90s, there were very, very strong fascist organisations such as the RNE and pseudo-fascist groups like the Monov group, the so-called National Bolsheviks, very strange hybrid group. And obviously, when there are people who want to open up attacks on them by direct confrontation. Now, I'm not a pacifist, but if you go into an individual fight or a group of you fight with a group of fascists, you can have a fight, but you're not going to defeat them. You're not going to undermine their actual situation. So you have to understand where they come from, and you have to be prepared to have political campaigning. For example, when the fascists were organising in London, particularly in the immigrant areas, the first thing we did was to organise mass mobilisations by leafleting around the homes and the workplaces in that area, calling on the trade unions that existed at the time to come out in support. And we mobilised a mass demonstration. And it was big enough so that when the fascists tried to attack it, first of all, we were able to defend ourselves. And of course, it was also possible to physically resist their attacks and to force them back. And it forced them back time and time again. But that is only possible when you have a mass mobilisation. And of course, for that as well, you need a united front approach with different trade unions, immigrant organisations, and so on and so forth to succeed. Of course, the other aspect is some people think, well, you should have a ban from the state. Well, there's many examples of where that doesn't work. For example, here in Russia, in the mid-90s, because the fascists were getting were so violent and were beginning to become a problem for the regime, they passed a law to ban the use of any fascist symbolic symbols. And of course, the first organisation that was taken to court for this law was an anarchist club, actually an anarchist club that had played quite a good role in trying to oppose the fascists in a political way, in joint action with us, because they had an anti-fascist symbol on the wall of a swastika crossed out. But they were taken to court for displaying fascist symbols. And it's always been the case, in my experience, that when laws are passed like that, they're used most of all against the left. They're used against people who are prepared to organise in defence of their rights. They're not used against the right wing or the far right or the fascists. So the best way to do it is by offering a clear, sharp fight back on the social economic issues that lead people to support fascism, because they don't see an alternative, and a mass mobilisation against the fascists when they dare to show their heads.
Thanks so much, Rob. And what a rich history of the organizing that you've done. And it's important that we learn, we learn that history so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And organization has proven itself, convincing people to join organization on a clear political basis, fighting for economic demands, social demands, is clearly the way to go. But, wrapping up our show here a little bit, fascism coming to power and the role of Stalinism led Trotsky to draw the conclusion that needed to move from the left opposition to a completely separate international organization. So, Rob, can you talk about that separate international organization and the support that it had outside of Russia?
Well, yes. We're talking about, first of all, the transformation of the left opposition in Russia to the international left opposition, which Trotsky described in the early period as not being a separate party, but a faction fighting for a change in policy. And that had widespread support, not just in Russia. It had big support, for example, in countries like China and Vietnam, where many communists had been studying at the International Communist University in Moscow. And many of the lecturers there were supporters of Trotskyist ideas. It had big support in parts of Europe, in part of Germany, for example, in Belgium. Nascent groups in Britain were developing. And of course, it built up, partly because of the work of your favourite communist, James Cannon, quite a big base in the United States. And by quite a big base, I mean one that played a big role in the trade union struggles of the 1930s, around the Teamsters battles, around the formation of the CIO and so on. Then in certain cities, you could say it had a mass base because of the role that it was playing. But of course, as you said, after 1933, after Hitler came to power, and the Comintern didn't think it was particularly significant, they said, oh, don't worry, in another year, the communists will come to power in Germany. At the same time as the Communist Party was being smashed by the fascist stormtroopers and so on. Trotsky drew the conclusion we need to move from a faction. We need no longer reforms in the Soviet Union, but a political revolution. Therefore, we need to form a world organization, which became known as the Fourth International and was formally founded in 1939. Now, some people ask, well, where does ISA come from? But if you want to trace our roots back, of course, we trace our roots back to the Fourth International. We trace our roots back to the left opposition and to the Bolshevik Party, of course, if you want to go back that far in their history. But the formation of the Fourth International was a huge statement of determination to build a new socialist Marxist revolutionary international, bearing in mind that to be a Trotskyist in the late 1930s meant that you were in danger of being fought by the Stalinists. And by being fought, I meant they were arresting people, murdering people for being Trotskyists. The fascists were doing the same in Germany and a whole number of countries. The imperialist countries were no friend of the Trotskyists. For example, there was a Trotskyist organization in Britain during the war, and I believe in Belgium the same happened, and their leaders were arrested and interned for a period during the war because of the role they played. For example, of even opening up the London Underground as bomb shelters during the Battle of Britain, because the government didn't want to do this, and the Trotskyists played a role. They played a role in the strikes of the miners later on in the war, and so on and so forth. So it took very courageous people. There were about 3,000 members of the Fourth International when it was founded. But of course, Trotsky, Cannon, a number of other leaders played a role in providing political leadership to it. Like the Bolshevik Party, it had its own internal discussions. There were debates over Spain because the group Poem around Andrei Nin, and Andrei Nin had earlier been a friend of Trotsky. Trotsky tried to persuade Nin and Poem to follow the correct policy in Spain, but they didn't do so. They succumbed to the Popular Front policy towards the end. But you had those discussions. You had discussions with the French section over what a revolutionary party really is, because they had a very weak understanding of what a revolutionary party should be. Certainly, they didn't understand the need for political clarity, both within the organization and publicly in its publications. You had the discussions that we've already discussed in the American section over the nature of democratic centralism, over the nature of the USSR, and whether the Trotskyists should support the USSR, albeit critically, during the Second World War. Of course, they decided that that was a correct position, given the analysis that they had at the time. But Trotsky died in 1940. Died, is putting it mildly, was murdered, executed by an ice axe held by one of Stalin's henchmen. Trotsky, of course, had been the key leader of the International, and before the war, he had a perspective that the Second World War would end up with a revolutionary wave, pretty much like what had happened after the First World War, because it wasn't expected that the Soviet Union would come out as a victor in the war, so that defeat would cause complete unrest in the Soviet Union and the possibility of a political revolution there, which would act as a spur to revolution in different countries. And at the same time, the overthrow of Hitlerism in Germany would also provoke revolutionary waves. Now, to a degree, he was correct. There was a revolutionary movement in Greece, a revolutionary movement in Italy, one in France. There was a massive shift to the left in Britain and a number of other European countries, let alone the wave of independence struggles in the third world. But the problem was, because the Soviet Union won the Second World War, the Communist Party had huge authority. So they, together with the Social Democrats that had mass support in a whole number of countries, derailed that revolutionary wave. They didn't want it to succeed. They led it down the wrong road, and capitalism survived. Now, Trotsky had also said that coming out of the Second World War, capitalism would continue its economic crisis for a period of time. Now, that didn't happen. Because of the Marshall Plan, because of the need to rebuild the capitalist economies after the destruction of the war, and we remember that countries like the US only came out of the Great Depression because of the rebuilding needed, but because of the war effort and so on, that led to a long 25 to 30-year economic boom, at least in the developed countries of Europe, of the US and so on. And that disorientated the new Fourth International without Trotsky. Cannon, for example, was still saying in the late 50s that the Second World War hadn't ended because the revolutionary wave hadn't taken place, as Trotsky predicted. And it became disorientating, and the Fourth International, in effect, split into different sections. And in that period, in the late 60s, around the time of the Great French General Strike in 1968, you had in effect the need for establishing a new international which became the Committee for the Workers' International. Now, I don't have time to go into the whole history of what happened to the CWI, but basically we went through a whole period of success in building, and then around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, a major split, and then further successes, and in a recent period, as many people know, a further split, which I don't have time to go into now, but that has led us now to the ICA, which I believe is the organisation that can really gather together, develop cadres in a whole number of revolutionary cadres across the world in order to provide the basis for a new revolutionary wave when it does develop.
Thanks so much, Rob. I mean, just hearing the history of the International Socialist Alternative is super exciting, and we have a lot of information if people want to learn a little bit more about the long legacy of our organization. We got to wrap up. We're going to do the shout out of the week, but before then, I've asked our viewers to say, but Rob, I want to ask you, the first thing I ever read by Leon Trotsky was the Transitional Program. But thinking about someone who is new to these ideas and wants to learn more, just maybe get their feet wet, what's something that you would recommend somebody to read?
Well, Tori, you're not going to like my answer. My life. It appears to be a large book, and it's not that large compared to the history of the revolution, but in my opinion, it gives a very good introduction to a whole number of key aspects of what Trotskyism is about. Some of his other books, of course, they concentrate on a particular aspect. But I've always liked my life for giving that overall view, if you like, of what the situation is. And then, of course, I read time and again, and it's much bigger than my life. The history of the Russian Revolution, there's so many lessons you can get out of that. It's worth reading many times over.
I guess I'll have to put my life on my list. It's a big book, but you know, his story is so rich and interesting. So I want to thank you, Rob, for joining us here today. Now we have our shout out of the week, best part of our show, and it goes to the New York City branch of Socialist Alternative in the US. They've been active throughout the city, forming and organizing tenant associations that have helped to win pro-tenant legislation, which of course is greatly needed during this time when it's estimated that 40 million renters could possibly be facing eviction this fall because of the pandemic. In New York, 51% of Black families have missed a rental payment during this pandemic. And although there is a moratorium on evictions, these terrible landlords have been doing illegal evictions. And housing insecurity, as we know, disproportionately affects Black and brown people. But the pandemic is affecting all layers of the working class right now. And we've seen, across the US and around the world, neighborhoods of people fighting back and literally linking arms to stop evictions from happening, which in the US, I'm not sure about the rest of the world, but in the US, the state uses the police force to do this. So our organization of the International Socialist Alternative in New York City participated in a march of hundreds of people calling to cancel rent, defund the police, and tax the rich. So shout out to the New York City organization for standing strong in the belly of the beast of American capitalism, as we say. If this is the type of work that inspires you and you want to join an organized fight back against a system that is killing our planet, that's making us homeless and keeping us hungry, then please check out our website and join today. No matter where you live in the world, we want you to join our global fight for socialism. So next week, we'll be discussing the world in revolt, from Bolivia to Belarus to Lebanon. So tune in, same time, same place.